Hello, my name is Nicole Chan. I'm a Boston wedding photographer, and today we are talking about wedding day timelines. For every single wedding, I always have a phone call or an in-person meeting with our couple to talk about how their wedding day timeline flows. We talk about the details, we talk about important people, we talk about a specific portrait checklist, and we go through everything to dot all the I's and cross all the T's to make sure that we craft a timeline that is not only realistic, but also provides a lot of buffer time so that we try to take out as much of the stress as possible on an already kind of chaotic day. But it doesn't have to be chaotic. So here's what generally our timelines look like, and I'd love to talk this through with you guys. Most of our wedding photography coverage is about 8 to 10 hours for most weddings. If you are having any sort of cultural or traditional aspects to your wedding, like for example, a Chinese tea ceremony or an Indian barat or a 3-hour Hindu ceremony, then your day might not exactly fall into this, but for all of my couples, we'll have a specific conversation about this anyway. But this is just a general guideline. Most of our studio's wedding day coverage lasts between 8 to 10 hours. And here's a general typical timeline of what that looks like. Now, keep in mind that if you are doing any sort of cultural tradition, like for example, a Chinese tea ceremony or an Indian barat or a 3-hour Hindu ceremony, then in that case, this might not apply to you. But for all of our couples that have booked with us, we'll have a specific conversation with you personally anyway. This is just a typical general overview. So we usually kick off with about an hour of getting ready. And then we add in a little bit of buffer time. You never know, you might just want to brush your teeth again or go to the bathroom, or somebody might be forgetting a sock or something. So that buffer time is really nice just to collect everybody. If the couple chooses to see each other before the wedding ceremony, this is the time where we can take what's called first look portraits. This can be just the couple, or it could also extend to taking family formals as well as bridal party formals as well. Lots of pros and cons to a first look, and we can also create a different video on that. If a couple decides not to see each other, there's also still an opportunity to take portraits separately without them seeing each other. So for example, if a groom is getting ready by himself, might be nice to get some photos of groom and his mom, groom and his dad, groom and his siblings, groom and his party, etc. Then we leave a little bit more buffer time to travel to the ceremony spot. And I don't really care if your ceremony spot is in the same space. We still leave a little bit of buffer time just because sometimes traveling from A to B, even if it's in the same building, takes a little bit of extra time anyway. Then we get to the ceremony. And at this point, I take a small step back and I let the wedding planners, wedding coordinators, and venue coordinators take over a little bit as they usher guests in and start the ceremony, hopefully close to the right starting time. Most of my couples are pretty punctual, but 10, 15, 20 minutes, not the end of the world if we're scooting a little bit late so that other guests can come and sit. So the ceremony runs. Afterwards, we usually have a cocktail hour. If your ceremony and reception space are different, then of course there'll be a little bit of travel time. Cocktail hour is typically about an hour. And during that time, if we did not capture all of the formal photos during the pre-ceremony time, this is when we would do all of the family formals, bride and groom, or groom and groom, or bride and bride portraits, and then also all the bridal party portraits. If extended family or specific special groups are going to be there at this time, we can also grab those folks in as well. After cocktail hour is over, reception starts. And at this point, again, we take a little bit of a backseat and we help your wedding coordinators make sure that food service gets out at an optimum time. So typically, our couple gets introduced in. There might be a couple toasts or speeches. There might be an appetizer. Somewhere around there, maybe some other formalities like first dance, parent dances, other entertainment, etc. Typically, photographers won't stay until the very, very end. We usually leave about, for us, we feel comfortable if we get a solid hour to an hour and a half of good dancing photos. We do this because towards the end of the night, the dancing photos start looking very similar, just a little bit sweatier. So it depends on how many blackmail photos you want of your friends and family as they're on the dance floor. There are some couples, however, that actually extend us into the first bit of their after party. So we'll be photographing their after party as well. I think it depends completely on the couple and what's important to them. Some couples really cherish the getting ready, so they might have us come a little bit earlier to capture all those getting ready, to have a little bit of extra time to photograph special details like invitations and rings and things of that nature. And then some couples couldn't care less about getting ready, and they would rather have all of the fun photos towards the evening. So it depends on how you feel about it. But let's go back to how this translates into an 8-hour segment. We start with what we know. So we know that, for example, your ceremony will be at 4, typically. If you're having a Catholic wedding, that might be at like 1 or 2, and then you have like this weird gap between the cocktail hour. We call that a Catholic gap. Again, separate situation, we'll talk it through with you. But let's just say that your ceremony was at 4, and let's just say that your ceremony was an hour. So if your ceremony is from 4 to 5, then typically, if you're at the same location, then your cocktail hour will be 5 to 6, and then your reception will be 6 to 10. With that said, this is probably the most standard Boston timeline that I've seen. If your ceremony doesn't start at 4, it might be 3, it might be 5, but that's the general wiggle around. So again, for this conversation, let's say it starts at 4. So we work backwards. We say that from 3:30 to 4, that's buffer time, even if you're getting ready in the same spot. From 3:30 backwards, an hour and a half. I love keeping an hour and a half set for first look portraits, because that means we get 30 minutes with the bride and groom, or groom and groom, or bride and bride. And then we get 30 minutes with the families, the immediate families, or the extended families if they're available to come early. And then we have 30 minutes with the bridal party. Probably overkilled for an hour and a half, but if we get that time, I would be really happy to have it. So from 3:30 back to 2 o'clock. So then we have getting ready from 1 to 2. Most people feel that 1 hour of getting ready is sufficient. I usually say that if you are hiring hair and makeup, to have them be finished an hour before we arrive. So if we're arriving, we as the photographers are arriving at 1, then your hair and makeup team will be done at noon. That way, you'll be getting touched up anyways. So even when we arrive at 1 o'clock, if for some reason hair and makeup is running a tiny bit late, we still have that hour of buffer time. The name of the game is buffer time, for me anyway. So we get there at 1. We'll probably catch you into a little bit of, little touch-ups here and there on makeup and hair. You jump into your dress or suit or tux, and then we photograph all of your details. If you are organized enough, it would be amazing if you could set aside all of your details into the corner so that we know exactly where everything is. Details can include whatever things that are important to you that are still life that you want to remember. So for example, rings, shoes, invitations, save the dates, any sort of specific jewelry that you may be wearing or that is important to you, any notes that you might have from people that you want to photograph. Sometimes handwriting is really nice to photograph. If you've written your own personal vows in a book or on a piece of paper or on your phone, you can just keep your phone there, we'll photograph that all together. But it's nice to be able to have a memory of all this still life stuff. And it's even better if you could scoot it all in a corner so we're not playing scavenger hunt on the day of. So another thing that we're doing between 1 to 2 is making sure that, actually, you know what? Before you get into your dress, we want to make sure that your bridesmaids and maybe your parents, whoever else is helping you get into your dress, is dressed before you. That way you're not getting like pajamas and stuff while you're putting stuff on. Once you have your dress on, maybe another quick round of touch-ups, bathroom, brushing of the teeth, just like general excitement of how real things are. And then we'll start planning where to take your portraits for your first look. Perhaps you're not seeing each other for the first time, but still want those pre-ceremony portraits with your immediate families and your bridal parties without your spouse. I would still recommend an hour. It's really great to be able to get all these portraits, especially if we want any photos of you solo, to get that before the ceremony while makeup, hair, and everything is fresh. So that 8 hours, if we start at 1 o'clock, 8 hours goes to 9 o'clock. So if you remember, we said that our ceremony was at 4, cocktail was at 5, reception 6 to 10. So if we leave at 9, it's pretty much perfect. We leave about 3 hours for the reception, and then you have 1 hour of the end of reception where you guys can go crazy without having to worry about cameras being in your face photographing every embarrassing detail or moment, unless you want us to. For a lot of couples, we'll check in around 8:15, 8:30, and we'll say, hey, we've got half an hour left of your coverage. Is there anything else that we can get for you? And sometimes they're like, you know what? Party's still going. Let's extend for another hour. And extending for an extra hour of photography coverage on the day of, totally fine. So it's nice to be able to have that option if in the case you wanted to extend us all the way until the very end to capture, maybe you have a very special last dance, or maybe you just want all of those crazy, chaotic, fun dance photos. So whatever the reason might be, we're happy to extend both on the day of, or if you know you want that ahead of time, we can extend it as we converse with you about your timeline. Frequently asked questions. What happens if you have a group of friends, but they won't be there before the ceremony to take the portraits? When is the best time to do that? 2 times. 1, we can do it during cocktail hour. 2, we can do it during the reception, and that we can obviously even ask the DJ to help announce different groups up. But the ideal situation is to do this all before the main course comes out. And now the reason is because once the main course comes out, you probably want to sit, relax, eat. Most of my couples are big foodies, and they've spent a lot of time and energy into crafting the food menu for their guests and for themselves. So food is very important to them. So that would be the best time. 1 is cocktail, 2 is during the reception before the meal time. Another frequently asked question is, when should we plan to take night portraits or sunset portraits? This is really interesting. So if we were to take sunset portraits, the optimum golden hour time is an hour before the actual sunset time. It's really easy to find out what time sunset is. You just Google in sunset, city, and the date, and you can find out when that is. Golden hour is typically 1 hour before. So we'll work with your schedule to figure out when that is and if we can steal you away for 10 minutes. Nighttime photos can happen obviously anytime after the sun goes down. And sometimes we like to steal you guys maybe in the middle of the dance floor when people won't notice that you're not around and all the formalities are already done. I always work with a DJ and a coordinator to make sure that they know that I'm going to steal you for 5 or 10 minutes, just so that if there's your favorite song or someone's looking for you, they'll know that you snuck out for a couple minutes. The third thing in terms of night portraits is called twilight. Twilight is when the sky turns this rich blue. It only happens for 10 or 15 minutes after the sun goes down. And if we can time that, gosh, it's my favorite time to photograph. It's also really cool. But I think that with every venue, being on the East Coast and the sun setting on the West, sometimes we don't get brilliant sunsets like you see in Southern California or Hawaii, but we'll do our best. And I think that for every single wedding, we'll find out where your venue is situated, where the sun is going down, and where we can be in order to get those best sunset or nighttime portraits. Other frequently asked questions can revolve around family portraits. So we have talked to many families who are very different about their approaches to family portraits. I'm going to make a whole different video on that, but the general timeline is that we want to schedule about 3 to 4 minutes for every family grouping. And the reason why is because we want to make sure everybody looks their best. People don't know where to stand. We want to make sure everyone is seen well. We also want to take a good amount so that no one is blinking, so that everyone is, nice and tucked in and buckled in and stuff like that. And we also want to make sure that prior to your wedding, preferably a month or 2 before, that we talk to you to create this family portrait list so that my assistant and I can just roll call them out, arrange them, take a bunch of photos, and do this as efficiently and as quickly as possible. We know that family portraits sometimes are not the most fun parts of weddings because they can be a little bit boring. However, we also know that our couples really cherish these portraits because in 30 or 40 or 50 years, it's nice to be able to see people's faces and to see people together as a group. Those are my general typical guideline tips for timelines, and thank you so much for listening. I would welcome all your questions, and for all of my couples that are getting married this year, next year, and the year after, would love to talk to you more, usually about 2 months before your wedding. We'll sit down together and we'll hash all this out. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments, and I will be more than happy to answer them. Thanks.